Yeah, I think this is a huge consideration. We've already seen that some Russian soldiers returned from the front do commit crimes. Originally, the Russian military was built very much on prisoners. Putin emptied the prisons of tens of thousands of people, giving them their freedom to go and fight. But a lot of them ended back there. I think the Russian soldiers are treated so badly are just sort of almost ignored by the Russian people that if they come back, and the only reason that a lot of them are at the front line is actually they get paid quite a lot of money by the Russian state. Once that money dries up, the anxiety, I think, will be huge. And we're talking about large numbers. They're thought to be about 600,000 Russians, fighting on the front line at the moment, quite apart from all of those trainings. So, you could see up to 1 million veterans being integrated back into a society that has struggled massively. So, yeah, it could be a really social headache and could create turmoil across Russia. The final element to this is the mothers of these veterans. We've discussed before that it was the mothers of Russia, the babushkas, who forced Russia to withdraw in defeat from Afghanistan in the 80s when they suffered 17,000 casualties. Now we're now 1 million. So yeah, there is a lot of social unrest building, I think, and that may well be a factor in Putin trying to prolong the war.
Also, according to the CNN, new intelligence reviewed by US and Western officials suggests that Putin may have shifted his focus in the war in Ukraine towards, quote, short-term objectives of solidifying his hold on territory his forces have seized and boosting his country's struggling economy. Does this mean that Putin begin to realize that his army is unable to capture the whole of Ukraine and is unable to reach his all military objectives?
I think that is absolutely the fact. And as we discussed earlier, a lot of analysts are really saying how little the Russian army has achieved in the last year, and they can't, and their ability to make headways because most of the Russian soldiers are inexperienced conscripts who've had very little training. Therefore, the Russians can only attack at sort of, company strength, 100 men at the most at any one time, not integrated with tanks and fighters and drones. They just don't have that ability. So it would be incongruous that they would make any progress. And I'm sure that is seeping back through. I think that is behind the comment in his 25th anniversary documentary at the weekend saying, well, I might have to use tactical nuclear weapons because my army just can't do it. And why I have written in the UK's Telegraph today saying we must be aware of this. And this is where the Americans and others must step up and ensure that Putin doesn't use a tactical nuclear weapon.
You just mentioned about the Russian threat of using nuclear weapons. According to the Telegraph, the United Kingdom is finally preparing for the war against Russia, preparing for a direct military attack by Russia by outlining and updating 20 years old contingency plans to put the country on war footing in case of direct attack. Also, a classified document will set out how the government would respond in case of attack by the Russian side. What is your assessment of this new military planning going on inside the British government?
Well, I think it's quite complex, and if I try and explain it as straightforwardly as possible, as you said, these plans haven't been reviewed for 25 years, and because of everything that's happening at the moment, people have rightly decided that we need to review them. At the end of the Cold War in the 90s, the peace dividend, as we call it, meant that militaries like Britain and other European countries really saved as much money as they can on the military. They saved as much money as they could by not having plans. In the Cold War, there were bunkers all over the UK where politicians and others would hide in if they were being attacked. There were stores of food in case the UK got cut off, and everybody in the country knew what to do if there was a nuclear strike. But for 25 years, we've just forgotten about it. But the UK seems to be very much the focus of a lot of threats coming from Putin, and he is frequently threatened, or his aides like Medvedev have threatened that they'll fire a nuclear missile at London. Now, I don't think anybody really until recently believed that they might do that. And I think it's part of that is what the review is all about. Also, the new government has a strategic defence review that is about to be announced very soon, recognising that Britain needs a stronger military to be able to create a deterrence against Putin. And also it's the UK and France who are leading what's called the Coalition of the Willing to provide a military force that would ensure that a ceasefire holds in Ukraine, hopefully when we've got it. But all of that put together means that the threats coming out of Moscow and threats coming from Putin, especially on the nuclear side, are now being taken very, very carefully and very seriously in London, because the final bit of this, we've talked about nuclear a few times, but Britain doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons. So if Putin fired a tactical nuclear weapon, the only thing open to Britain would be to fire a strategic nuclear weapon, which would then potentially create a much wider nuclear conflict. So there is an imbalance at the moment. And I think the British and other European countries are trying to make sure that they can redress that, because when Putin looked west back on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a conventional deterrence in Europe that would stop him invading Ukraine. And when he looks west now, there is a nuclear imbalance, and that equilibrium needs to be sorted out as soon as possible. So I think it is a demonstration by the British government to Putin that we're serious about this, and Britain is not going to back down and is going to support Ukraine as long as it takes to get a just ceasefire for Ukraine.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.
Well, again, Daniel, my belief is, looking at history, is that the Russian forces today will not be able to cross the Dnieper River anytime soon. And therefore, they will need a period of rest. They will need to rebuild. They will need to replace their main battle tanks, their artillery shells. They will need to repair the wounded. They will need to create new supply lines. And they will need that. That will probably take a few years. But the worry here is that Russia has done it once. They have had an extremely difficult time. They probably expected to subjugate the whole of Ukraine within days back in February of 2022. But they will have learnt their lesson. They would come back stronger. The whole Russian defense industrial base is now on a war footing. And therefore, within a matter of a few years, Russia will be ready for this next big push. They would know how to get across the Dnieper River. And unless Ukraine was very well prepared, that would probably signify the start of the next phase of battle. So for me, what's key here is that Russia will eventually grind to a halt. For now, the challenge, of course, then is how on earth does Ukraine secure the security guarantees it needs to make sure that Russia cannot do that next push forward? And that won't be something that Ukraine can do alone. I suspect that is something that ideally NATO would have provided, but it looks unlikely that NATO will be the answer. So what are the elements of that security that needs to be in place, not just a signature on a bit of paper, but actual credible deterrence that will stop Russia from coming again in a few years' time?
Let's also cover recent developments in the assassination campaign inside Russia. Recently, Russian General Yaroslav Moskalik has been killed in car bomb attack near Moscow. And last year, in December last year, another Russian General, Igor Kirillov, was killed in the bomb attack. How do you see the main consequences of this attack on Vladimir Putin's chain of command and his army, and how do you see the psychological consequences of this?
Yes, I mean, when that assassination came through, it was big news, but it's not the first time that Russian generals have been attacked. Whilst it captured the news headlines, if you look at it from a strategic perspective, Russia has got lots of generals. This will not affect the war at all. I think what it does do is it's part of Ukraine's strategy to demonstrate that they can take the war to Russia. Russia isn't in complete control. What Russia is trying to do is to keep the war in Ukraine's boundaries so that Muscovites and those people in Russia can get on with their day-to-day lives and just listen to the news and hear tales of fancy of what's going on. By targeting Russian generals on the ground, by closing down the Russian airports, by targeting Russian oil supplies, refineries, and key airfields, what Ukraine is very effectively doing is demonstrating to the Russian population that President Putin is not in control, that he is fighting a war, and that Ukraine is capable of fighting back. But I wouldn't want to read too much into the loss of one Russian general. It is of concern for Russian forces, but quite bluntly, in an autocratic regime, as in Russia, President Putin has a lot of disposable generals. He will not miss a beat just because he loses one or two to assassinations.
Let's cover also, you just mentioned about Vladimir Putin. It's 25 years of Vladimir Putin's rule, and Russian propaganda channels have produced this big documentary about Vladimir Putin. He was showing journalists his flat in Kremlin. It's interesting that there weren't any kind of windows in his flat. Did you see this film, and what is your impression of this demonstration of Putin's main achievements?
I deliberately didn't watch that, Daniel, because I am not the target audience for that film. The target audience was the domestic Russian audience. And I think what's telling is under normal times, Putin would never do that sort of documentary, that sort of film. I think what's very clear is that if you remember, Yevgeny Prigozhin led that march against Moscow, and it was quite surprising how far he got. President Putin will be worried that as the death rate starts to rise, as more and more Russian soldiers go back home with bad injuries and tell the story about what's actually going on the front line, not what you're reading about, but what's actually going on, that does create a very different atmosphere in Russia. And the danger is Putin will believe that people will turn against him. So the more he can do to demonstrate that he is a long-term leader, that he's Mr. Security, that he cares for Russia, that he only has Russia's long-term interests at heart, and that he's painting this as an existential threat to the Russian way of life. This is all part of him trying to secure the support of his domestic audience. It's got nothing to do with what's actually going on and everything to do with trying to bolster President Putin's popularity back at home so that he doesn't suffer the end, as so many dictators before him suffer, a very ignominious and a very swift end. He's very keen to avoid that.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian military intelligence has shot down two Russia's Su-30 fighter jets using maritime drones for the first time in the history of modern warfare. How can you assess this innovative way to destroy enemy's aircraft?
I think this is a fascinating story because it creates more questions than answers. It is the Maruva B7, I think it is, your maritime drone. It's not particularly big. It's very fast. It's normally packed full of explosives and driven towards Russian ships and explode on impact. On this particular occasion, it had a couple of missiles loaded onto it. Originally, these would have been former Russian or Ukrainian missiles, but actually it appears this time they were Sidewinder missiles, which are provided by the West. They're an air-to-air missile. They're infrared guided. In other words, unlike a radar missile that has to send out a signal to find where the enemy aircraft is, and therefore the enemy aircraft knows this missile is coming. With something like the Sidewinder, it's purely picking up the heat signature of the engine of the aircraft. The aircraft doesn't know the missile is coming at it, and therefore it can be very successful. But how on earth, when I used to fire Sidewinder missiles, we would fire one of those every 2 years to make sure we understood how it worked, how difficult it was to aim. You had to have the aircraft really steady. You had to put the tracking mechanism onto the target aircraft. You had to listen for a tone when the missile locked onto the target, and then you would press the trigger and fire the missile off. Well, last time I saw these maritime drones, they're bouncing along on the water like mad. So it's very difficult to provide a stable sighting situation for these missiles. Also, when they come off the rails of a military jet, you're already doing 400 miles an hour, so they're already flying. If you're now throwing them off a small maritime drone, how on earth do they get flying speed? How do they pick up the target? So I think there's lots of questions here, but without a doubt, this is a really good example of two Su-30 Russian aircraft were apparently shot down. One of the crews was killed, one of the crews survived. And this is a really good example of Ukraine using asymmetric technology, using innovation, using surprise, using deception to create some opportunities to shoot down state-of-the-art Russian aircraft. And I believe it's not the first time they've done this. They've done it with a helicopter as well, but it will certainly have left Russia wondering which way to turn and how on earth it guarantees the security of its very, very valuable fighter jets.
Let's cover our final topic. I just wanted to cover with you the air battle between India and Pakistan. According to CNN, a dogfight between Pakistani and Indian Air Force has occurred, and more than 100 fighter jets participated in this fight, which could be the longest and the largest such dogfight in the history of modern aviation. What is your take on this story from your personal experience?
Yeah, again, Daniel, I've been involved in Royal Air Force and air power for most of my lifetime. There are so many bits of this story that don't quite sit comfortably with me. First of all, the targets that were struck by India are all relatively close to the border. And if you were wanting to have an effect on the ground, you would use long-range missiles, and your fighter jets would never need to go anywhere near Pakistani airspace or Pakistani-controlled Kashmir airspace. So why you would risk your aircraft by pushing them into that space, I do not know. I would understand why you might put drones into that airspace to help identify the targets, to choose the best time and place to fire those long-range missiles. But originally, Pakistan claimed they had shot down 5 Indian Air Force jets. There's no proof of that at the moment. More and more information is coming out. But at its heart, let's be clear here, this is 2 nuclear powers, both of which believe that Kashmir is theirs. Let's not forget China is also administers part of Kashmir. But those 2 nuclear powers absolutely do not want to escalate to a nuclear war. It's almost certain that they would only use nuclear weapons if their very nations became threatened. So this is about the attack that Indian folks, that India believes that Pakistan sponsored the terrorists, India is therefore punishing Pakistan for doing that. But the language around all of this was very measured. And I was very struck by the Pakistanis going, okay, the international community was saying, what are you going to do next? How are you going to retaliate? And their language was much more, look, we pay a big price for this. We shot down 5 of their fighter jets. I think we don't need to do any more. All of that language, whether they do or they don't, it's all language that's trying to de-escalate the situation. Both sides have demonstrated their willingness to respond if the other does something, but neither side wants to see this escalate to any full confrontation.
And it seems like US President Trump doesn't really care much about the situations. The US were not involved in such big diplomatic efforts to end this conflict. Do you feel that as a sign that the US is walking away from the international stage?
I don't know. If I was part of President Trump's team, he's made lots of promises about bringing peace to the war in Ukraine, and he's done nothing. He's told about bringing Hamas and bringing the war to an end with Israel. Bluntly, Israel's back on the front foot and now appears to have plans to occupy Gaza permanently. I think President Trump is going to be a little bit more careful about making promises about what he can achieve and then not being able to deliver. And I think at the moment, his advisors almost certainly are telling him, look, ever since 1947 and the partition of India at the end of the Second World War, there has been unrest around Kashmir. There will always be fighting unless that situation is resolved once and for all. But you don't need to get involved, America. Both sides do not want to see this escalate to nuclear war. The language on both sides seems to be restricting it. So the advice would be, why would President Trump want to get involved? Just steer well clear for now. Keep an eye on what's going on and only keep your powder dry because you might need to use it later on.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.